Hi, I thought your talk was great, and I'm curious about the specifics, which I don't know about. During the introduction about the New York Times, you worked for them, and were you writing as a journalist or a columnist, and what exactly was that incident where you got fired?
I would be the last person they would allow to write as a columnist.
Okay.
I was a foreign correspondent for pretty much 15 years, and I came back to the United States. I was in the Middle East for 7 years. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia. I was in Sarajevo, and then I covered Al-Qaeda based in Paris. I came back to the United States and watched this propaganda effort to attack Iraq, a country that I have spent months of my life in. I was in the first Gulf War. I went into Kuwait, occupied Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. I was in Basra during the Shiite uprising until I was captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I like to say I was embedded with the Iraqi Republican Guard. And like most Arabists, I speak Arabic, I understood that that every argument put forth to invade Iraq was based on fantasy. It was utopian, the way Thomas More coined the word in 1516, utopia, which means literally no place, doesn't exist. We've probably never thought of Dick Cheney as a utopian. But in that sense, he was. The idea that democracy was going to be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, the idea that we were going to be embraced as liberators, the idea that the oil revenues would pay for reconstruction. This was a non-reality-based belief system. And for those of us who came out of the Middle East, we realized that Saddam Hussein's regime was a shadow of what it had been before 1991. His military was decrepit and useless. He was isolated, spending most of his time locked in lavish palaces writing bizarre romance novels. His heir apparent, Uday, had been badly crippled, almost killed in an assassination attempt. It was a policy of containment, and we can argue about the sanctions. But the policy of containment was working. He was neither a threat to his neighbors nor to us. And so to speak out about this at that time was, although I spoke from great personal experience, was deemed a political position.
What did you say specifically that offended them so much?
Well,
all those things, or
all those things, plus what finally finished my career at the New York Times was I gave a commencement address at Rockford College. You can go home and watch it on YouTube tonight, where I denounced the war, and the crowd reacted very angrily. At one point, they all stood and began singing "God Bless America." My microphone was cut twice. People were shouting things at me. At the end of the 18-minute talk, 2 young men in graduation robes got up and tried to push me off the podium. So I'm speaking as the campus security is trying to knock them down. They didn't want to give the awarding of the diplomas while I was still on the stage, so they closed all of the roads out of the campus except for one, and the security came and took me off the platform before the students would come up and get their diplomas. And I was in an academic gown, and I said, but my jacket, it's in the president's office. And they said, we'll mail you your jacket. And they took me to my hotel, stood there while I packed my bags, took me to a bus station, put me on a bus to Chicago. It's my last visit to Rockford, Illinois. And of course, the right-wing media picked it up. The trash talk, cable, and radio had a field day because they had the footage, the home movie footage, and they pushed the hand of the New York Times to respond. And so I was called in and given a formal written reprimand for impugning the impartiality of the newspaper by speaking out against the war. And that I was gilled. So that was the process by which you give the employee a written warning, and the next time they violate that warning, they're fired. And I'm not going to pretend to you that that was a fun or an easy day. Nobody wants to lose their job and have any money. And I will go back to my dad, who had been a civil rights activist, an anti-war activist, and finally a gay rights activist. His brother, my uncle, his youngest brother, was gay and lived with his partner in Greenwich Village, so my father had a particular understanding of the pain of being a gay man in America in the 50s and 60s, and my dad was very outspoken for gay ordination, gay rights. When I think that for all of his stances, that's the one for which the institutional church was least forgiving. And I sat in that office, my father died in 95, I sat in that office and I realized that I was faced with a choice. I'd, by the way, been part of the team that had won the Pulitzer the year before for the New York Times. I faced a choice where I could pay fealty to my career, but to do so would be to betray my father. And I couldn't do that. And so I left the paper.
Well, good for you.
Hello, Mr. Hedges. First of all, I want to thank you for not only endorsing Ralph Nader in the last election, but also writing such a wonderful piece as you did explaining why everyone should. And it has everything to do with what you said tonight. It has to do with moral clarity. It has to do with principle. But it also has to do with something else. It has to do with a very simple understanding of math and how the Electoral College works. And I've been explaining for 10 years to people who can't seem to understand this, but understand sports scores and how to box the races at the horse race, which I still haven't figured out, that there are 40 safe states in every election. So the one thing you did say tonight that I'm curious about, because I'm a bread baker, I bake bread, I use a lot of New York State wheat, I use more of it every year. I use a lot of local ingredients in my cafe. This is my local activism. I'm also a peace activist and many other things, but you're right, we need to organize locally. I also am still very politically active, and I agree with you that it perhaps is futile, but in the interest of generations down the road, I still bang my head against that brick wall. And what frustrates me is I see that there could be such a simple change if we could wake people up. And I see the beginnings of that in the original Tea Party movement, Ron Paul, right. 2003, the libertarians. What I'm curious about is I know why Bill McKibben's given up because I've talked to him about it. I know why Ralph Nader's given up because I've talked to him about it. I know why Jim Kunstler's given up. Michael Moore, it's obvious he wanted to make some money selling books. But why have you given up on electoral politics? Can we not make people understand that all they need to do is stop voting in these safe states for two-party war candidates?
Because every year the Democrats promise all sorts of stuff. And as soon as they go to Washington, they serve corporate interests. And Obama's the perfect example. The fact is, if you look at how the system is rigged, we as citizens have no input. I mean, Bill McKibben is one of our most valiant activists, and a friend of mine, and someone I admire very much. And what happened? I mean, look at the sweat and effort he put into 350.org in anticipation of Copenhagen. And it made no difference. Anybody who showed up at Copenhagen got arrested. I mean, anybody, a lot of people. I was at the G20 in Pittsburgh, and they turned the whole center of the city into the green zone. I mean, literally, they brought back a National Guard battalion from Pennsylvania in full combat gear. And I can tell you that 80+% of the people protesting were retired Quakers in sandals. It was totally disproportionate, but not accidental, because it was a message to the rest of the country, don't try this. And in fact, I think we're so far down the road that we have to begin to think about self-sustaining communities if we're going to survive. I mean, why is Bechtel walking around the world trying to buy up all the clean water? And what are they doing to your water right here? They're killing it. I mean, if you want to find out what fracking is going to do to upstate New York, go down and look at what the coal mines did to West Virginia. And look at the kind of promises that they made to those West Virginia farmers when they bought up the mineral rights to their land, which is what they're doing up farmers here in upstate New York. We are now fighting, or we have to begin to fight, forces that in theological terms are forces of death.
Well, I guess not to interrupt and not to take more time, but you broached food safety, as they like to call it in my air quotes, and what they've done since organics legislation and since. I mean, it's aberrant what the government is now doing in honor of agribusiness, and it's very scary.
Yeah.
So those of us who are trying to use local and set up these economic systems are probably a very small group, a very small minority in the population who really understand that all of the rules are stacked against us. It's worse than the political arena.
Right, well, they're trying to
and it's getting even worse.
They're trying to destroy you.
How can, in your view, how can we really fight that as individuals? How organized do you think we're going to get in the 5 years we might have?
We're going to have to reach a point where we break the law.
Right. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you very much.
Yeah. A couple of things. I have the liberal class analogy that you're making is interesting, but I have a bit of a problem with it historically because, in my opinion, first of all, the Democratic Party was never a real friend of the working person or anything else. If you look back in history, I don't care whether you go to LBJ and the Vietnam War or Truman and breaking strikes after World War II and the beginnings of the witch hunt, or if you go back to Wilson and World War I, even Roosevelt. What was Roosevelt's real role? Save capitalism so it would continue to exist, which he did. And sometimes you have to alienate fellow capitalists in order to save the system.
Well,
he was willing to do that.
That's my whole point, that was the function of the liberal class, to save capitalism. And I fully agree with you. And I began the talk by saying I'm not a liberal. But that is the role of the liberal class. But when those liberal institutions can't even do that, which they couldn't do, which is why we have a permanent underclass, then we are in a situation in which the rapacious and predatory nature of the corporate state is such that they can literally work and create conditions of such immense suffering that it begins to cause, quite literally death.
There's an alternative scenario, however, which is actually playing itself out right now in France, where the entire working class of the country, now being joined by students, are in open rebellion.
Well, that's the problem. I've lived in France, and that's the problem with the United States and France, that we are sheep. If you told French university students that they had to pay $50,000 a year to go to college, they'd shut the damn country down. And all we do is please, can we have another loan? Or can I stay on my mommy's health insurance policy till I'm 26? It's just crazy.
But in fact, though, if we study our own history, we've had periods of great rebellion going back to the 19th century with the great strikes of 77, 94.
Well, that's a longer discussion.
The 30s. But
yeah, you're right.
What I'm saying is that I think you're painting too dark a picture, and that in the sense that don't give up on the American working class. It's only beginning to rub its eyes now and come out of the sleep.
Let's be clear.
All right?
We don't have an American working class. There's been a Weimarization of the American working class. What we call the working class now is a service class, where people have 2 and 3 jobs, where workers at Walmart who average 28 hours a week are below the poverty line. The possibility of a working class where one figure in a household could hold a job with a salary that could support a family, to buy a small house, maybe even send their kids to college with pensions and benefits, the corporate state has destroyed that. They've destroyed our working class.
Well, sorry, Chris, but once again, I think that's an often made exaggeration. In fact, the American working class in manufacturing still produces as much or not more than China does. We haven't disappeared yet. I'm one of them, I happen to know. So I think we have to look to see that there's a possibly alternative outlook aside from sort of retreating into the village and pulling their house over our heads.
These manufacturing jobs that have left, whether it's in Youngstown, Ohio, or Camden, New Jersey, or Detroit, are not coming back. They're not coming back. And that's what makes this quote-unquote recession different from every other recession within the roller coaster ride of capitalism. We have allowed corporations to decimate our manufacturing base. We have shifted, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, from an empire of production to an empire of consumption. And real wages in this country have declined since the early 70s. We borrowed, in essence, to maintain both an empire and a level of consumption that we can no longer afford. And, we're selling $2 billion a day in debt to the Chinese. We have racked up $12.8 trillion in debt, which, when we have to start servicing this debt, means selling about $96 billion of debt a week. And one day, it has to stop. It's not a sustainable system. You don't need Economics 101 to figure it out. And what happens then, if people don't want to buy our debt, is that the buyer of last resort becomes the Federal Reserve, which in essence means printing endless amounts of money. And at that point, our currency becomes junk. That's where we're headed. And we better start waking up, because if we don't wake up, we're going to get whacked. And the tragedy of American culture is that across the political and cultural spectrum, we are fed this mantra that if we dig deep enough within ourselves, if we focus on happiness, if we grasp that we are truly exceptional, if we find our inner strength, we can have everything we want. Reality is not an impediment to what we desire. And that's magical thinking. And it is rammed down our throats. Oprah does it every week. Everybody does it. And that, in essence, has created a culture that is probably the most illusioned culture on the planet. And an illusion is different from a dream. A dream is something you seek, you drive towards. An illusion is something that you live in. And when you live in an illusion, you remain in a state of perpetual infantilism, childishness. You never grow up. And now that gap is opening between the illusion of who we think we are and where we're going, and the reality. And when finally our personal world collapses, when it's our house that is repossessed or foreclosed, when we go bankrupt because we can't pay medical bills, when we finally grasp that that job we had is never coming back, not only for us but for our children, then we react like a child. We scream for a demagogue, for a savior, for some buffoon like Glenn Beck, who promises moral renewal, revenge, and new glory. That story is as old as time. Aristophanes wrote about it in the collapse of ancient Greece. I watched it in the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. It happened in Weimar. It opened the door for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and that is where we are. That's the precipice we're standing upon.
Yes. It seems to me that your focus is the nation state, with the United States being the nation state, and more with corporate influence, that a state is not a relevant term, that it's a market. And the market is neither Canadian nor American nor European or African, as you cite with Bechtel. How much water can purchase around the world? And so that what are the implications for the sovereignty of a nation state with such institutions as world trade and all these other things? How does that fit into what you're talking about here today?
Well, the cohesion breaks down. That's what happens when complex societies break down. And what we're undergoing is not anything that within the course of history is unfamiliar. It has happened to innumerable civilizations. The Greeks, most people, with the exception of Christians and Jews, or that Judaic-Christian sort of biblical vision, which views time as linear. Most cultures don't view time as linear. They view time as cyclical. Eastern culture does. Ancient Greece did. So you have a period of growth, maturation, decline, decay, and death. And when you are on the downward part of that arc, societies inevitably retreat into spectacle and illusion. It's what Cicero wrote about at the end of the Roman Empire. It's what Joseph Roth wrote about at the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You disconnect from reality because it's just emotionally too uncomfortable or unpalatable to accept what's happening around you. And I saw it in the war in the former Yugoslavia, where I would go into Pristina during the war in Kosovo with Kosovar Albanian friends of mine, highly educated, multilingual, and they would say, no, there's no war. There isn't going to be a war. Same thing happened in Sarajevo on the eve of the war. And I'd say, well, 10 kilometers outside of Pristina, I was stopped by the Kosovo Liberation Army. No, they were Serb police dressed up as Kosovo Liberation Army fighters to justify the repression again. I mean, they had no idea what was happening until Serb paramilitary literally herded them out of their homes, forced them onto boxcars, and drove them to refugee camps in Macedonia. And I think that is a common inability to understand the frailty of a system. We give it a kind of permanence that it doesn't have. So what will happen? Well, what will happen is that the society itself will fragment. What's dangerous about this time around is that when civilizations deplete and disintegrate, they can either migrate, they can do what the Aztecs did, or to create sort of localities, sustainable localities, abandon their great cities like Tikal, and new civilizations can rise, either through migratory movements or through the rise of new populations. But now that alternative is over. We have nowhere else to move. We have destroyed and depleted everything without the planet, so that when the ecosystem goes down this time, it won't be local. It'll be worldwide. And the cost for the human race will be awful. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, global warming would still accelerate, still continue, probably up to at least 550 parts per million. If we stopped all carbon emissions today, and we haven't. We pretend it's not happening. And yet all the scientific evidence is there. All we have to do is read Jim Hansen's reports. And we pretend none of this is going on. And the worse it gets, the more we fold inward, the more we're consumed by emotionally tawdry spectacle and trivia and gossip. What is it? What's the latest? Tiger Woods' mistress's sex tape? I don't know. John Edwards' saga. I mean, it's just awful. And those who get up and try and speak about it are hated for it. As Cicero was. Cicero, Mark Antony, despite Antony and Cleopatra, was the one who hunted down Cicero and had him assassinated, beheaded him and cut off his hands, and took his head and his hands to the Colosseum where 40,000 people were in attendance, and put the severed head in the hands and said, "He will never speak or write again." And the Colosseum roared its approval. That's where we're headed.
Hi, thanks for your compelling words. Trying not to be a defeated liberal. Been active for over 10 years in the Green Party as a third party. I'll put in a plug for Howie Hawkins, who's running for governor in New York. Please vote. It sounds to me like you're saying, like you said to Matt of Rock Hill Bakery, don't bother with politics. And the Greens have been very slow and working locally, so I'm going to say we're bothering. And I see us more as leadership for the resistance. So my question to you is, how can we reach out and spread this, start the resistance? What's your advice? I
don't have any problem with going to vote. That's a process that at most takes 1 or 2 hours. That's all people do, and they think they've finished. Voting is such a minor part of beginning to reform and reshape our society. Look, I will not vote for Democrat. I was in there the last election voting for members of the Revolutionary Socialist Party. I didn't even know who they were. I don't care. So I'm quite happy to muck up the system. But voting, and everybody should vote for the Green candidate, great. But stop thinking that the route to reform is electoral politics. And I think that, we can create enclaves. We can vote people into positions of local power that act as some kind of a firewall against corporate abuse. But even if you vote people into local power, let's say, for instance, in a town in upstate New York, are you going to be able to stop these companies from fracking on your land? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, we have to be realistic. I was a war correspondent. We didn't use the words pessimism and optimism. Those are ridiculous words. We had to make very sober assessments about what the weapons systems were at the end of that road, what the capacity of those systems were to do us harm, and then act accordingly. And people who lived in a fantasy land, that somehow they were invulnerable, and I saw them. I had a colleague in Sarajevo I was driving an armored vehicle. He had a thin-skinned, meant just a regular car, and he spray-painted on the side of it, "Save your bullets, I'm immortal." And he would drive across the disputed airport in Sarajevo to the Croatian town of Kiseljak and buy cigars and drive back. He's a cripple. I know another young reporter who also thought he couldn't get hit, stood up in a firefight, was shot through the head and killed. That we can't talk about hope until we grasp the reality. Because otherwise, if we don't grasp the reality, then everything we do is futile, because it is essentially appealing to a system that can't be appealed to. It is disheartening, but once we understand the paradigm of power, then we can begin to make decisions that can muck up that power system. But that, I'm afraid, requires a very dark understanding of where we are. And I think it's very late in the game.
Hi, I'm so glad you're here. I read your article on TruthDig every week. I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about anti-intellectualism, and particularly one of our local issues right now is the attacks on the humanities at SUNY Albany. And there's a sit-in or an event right now. And I mean, students right now, I'm a PhD student, but undergrads assume thousands of dollars of debt for public degrees. Yeah. So that they're it seems like another form of kind of enslavement to the state, the situation of student debt, and the kind of dismantling of the public universities for private gain. I'm just wondering, do you think that's a space still worthy of fight? And also just how that attack on the humanities plays into the ability, like I'm noticing in your talk, I mean, you're quoting Dostoevsky and philosophers here and there, and it's great, and that's exactly the type of thinking that's being devalued again and again.
Well, the attack on the humanities is intimately connected with the rise of the corporate state, because the corporate forces look at the humanities, and correctly so, as subversive. If you grapple with the humanities, then what you are doing is asking questions and challenging cultural, political assumptions and structures. And that's why they put Socrates to death. And what the corporate state wants is vocational training for drones. And that's what they're getting in the for-profit universities. They've abolished the classics department, the Italian department, the French department, right? The German department. And theater.
Theater and French.
Yeah. Well, look, you can't be a complete human being if you don't understand those non-rational forces that make us human. All of those things that can't be measured empirically. Love, grief, the struggle with our own mortality, the search for meaning. I mean, Freud said, I can write about sex, but I can't write about love. It's a mystery. And that's what I think, like great religious writers, great philosophers, great artists, great novelists, great poets, that's what they seek to retain. These forces that finally make us human, that make it possible for us to see in the other, not the stranger or the enemy, but the reflection of ourselves. And that's why they want to destroy the humanities. They don't want you to think. And they've done a damn good job of it. And it's terrifying. Because if we lack empathy, if we're not capable of empathy, then we accept the caricatures and the stereotypes. I mean, the racism in this country towards Muslims, the kinds of things that are said in the mainstream about Muslims, which we couldn't say about any other ethnic group, are patently not only untrue. I speak as someone who spent many years living in the Muslim world, but dehumanizing. They only understand violence. The Quran is let's look at history. I'm sorry, in terms of the body count, the Christians are way ahead. So, yeah, I'm with you. And, I wrote this book, The Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and the Triumph of Spectacle, and that's really the theme. It's the theme of how we are creating, even within our educational systems, corporatized entities that are geared towards producing systems managers. People who have a very narrow, specific kind of intelligence, which is, of course, what standardized testing rewards. This bizarre analytical intelligence. The poster child of this is Lawrence Summers, who was the youngest tenured economics professor at Harvard and has the common sense of a 12-year-old. And he's still there. And Geithner and Alan Greenspan, whose favorite book is Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. These are the people running the country. And they're illiterate. They're illiterate in the real sense of the word. They're illiterate. And that's what they want. They want us to be illiterate. And they're doing a damn good job of it. I just was spoke at the University of Washington in Pullman, and they had 10% budget cuts. So what did they do? They didn't touch the gleaming business school. They cut philosophy and theater. And boy, that's not accidental. Everything is determined, its worth is determined by its ability to generate money. So English departments don't generate money, let's whack them. But robotics, I've taught at Princeton. The robotics department in Princeton is funded almost exclusively by the Defense Department. Well, that's a good one. Let's expand that one. That's where we're at.
I've come across like 3 or 4 different questions or statements as you've been talking, and I've been standing in line. I'm a high school art teacher, and I was first going to talk to you about imagery and how I really take pride in the fact that I am teaching critical thinking skills and teaching creative problem-solving skills and trying to teach kids how to read the imagery, even if it's just a vertical image versus a horizontal image. So I was going to talk to you about that. But then I was listening to what John asked about the revolutions, the in-the-street people in France and Spain and Greece and how they are doing that. And I kind of got from your response that you don't necessarily see that here. And there's a couple of cases where I'd like to, one positive case where I do think it started to happen was in the Republic Windows in Chicago, where they had the sit-in and they actually got the company started again, and they fought and they won. And one very cynical thing was just what happened last weekend, 2 weekends ago in Washington, with the One Nation March, which was not a march, and they didn't let the people march. They didn't have the people march because they don't want the people to march. Right. And the power of the march is what I think is going to be very, very strong. But something else, too, is in regards to the Tea Party movement. And I'm saying all this stuff and you can respond, but the Tea Party movement, those people want to shout. Those people are angry, like you said. And I think that I saw it in Binghamton when I went down for the hydrofracking hearings with the EPA. And there were 2 men, and the 2 men that spoke to me most clearly were 2 farmers from Pennsylvania, from, I think, near Dimmock, from Wyoming County. And the one farmer, all he did was stand up, and he was classic, literal redneck. And he said, It was the worst decision I ever made. It is poison. And the second man stood up a while later and he said, I love this country. I support our troops. God bless America, but don't hydrofic. It's poison. And these two men came up from Pennsylvania to Binghamton to speak about that. And I do think that the people, if you get them into the point where you get this anger and you can focus it, and you can get them to realize that they are poisoning us, and you can get the Tea Party people to realize that we're being poisoned, that it'll work. And I do think we can have a revolution. I do think we can get the people in the streets.
I think the problem is this, that traditionally there should have been members of the liberal class, whether in the press, whether anywhere else, who stood fast on these values. And they didn't. And I think that's the reason, finally, the anti-war movement doesn't have any traction. Because the kids who are in Iraq and Afghanistan come from families that, let's be frank, were betrayed by the liberal class. And we have ourselves to blame. So I think you're right that there is a tremendous anger and rage there, and it's a legitimate anger and rage. But at least within the official liberal establishment, liberals still speak in the dead language of policy and issues.
I totally agree with you on that.
And if we don't do what you're saying, what we're going to do is cede this movement and this rage to proto-fascists. That's why I'm attacking the liberal class, that we have to make this rage our own, and we haven't. And because we haven't done that, we are providing deeply racist, homophobic, anti-democratic forces with human fodder.
I don't argue with you there. I don't consider myself a liberal, but I don't consider I'm left of liberal. But,
well, I'm getting old. On a bad day, I get mushy once in a while. I'm a liberal, but.
Okay, we're having our last question.
Well, I thought you'd taken my thunder, but you didn't pick up on it. I'm wondering whether the illusion to which you are referring is limited to the United States at this time and perhaps not to Europe, Greece, and Spain, and what you're seeing there. And are there models of rebellion, or are they equally illusional, just acting out differently?
No, I don't think the rebellions in Greece and Spain and France are illusional. I think the reason we're not rebelling is because we are illusioned. And we have to shatter this illusion of who we are. Everybody thinks the profligate consumption is coming back. Everybody thinks that we can continue indefinitely to speak to the rest of the world exclusively in the language of violence. And that's an illusion. And the Greeks are not illusioned about who's running them and who's screwing them and why. Neither are the French. I mean, look, Sarkozy's. He's right up there with Bush, if you want to talk about a cretin. But he's trapped, at least he's got a nice-looking wife, but he's trapped inside his, the streets of Paris don't belong to him. And I'm all with you that we have to get out, but we are just entranced by electronic hallucinations, which peddled fantasy, which most Americans believe. And these systems of propaganda and brainwashing and miscommunication are very, very sophisticated. And if we sever ourselves from a print-based culture, and we rely on these systems, which many people do already, for their understanding of reality, then we are, in essence, captive. That's my fear. Thank you very much.